Hello again and welcome back to our course on Access 2016. In this section we're going to continue setting up the trip table, and we're going to turn our attention now to the next field, which is activity level. Now the key difference between activity level and the fields we've dealt with so far is that activity level is going to offer the operator, the person setting up the trips, a number of options, and the operator will choose from the options. Now the actual number could be quite a small number, as in this case we're just going to set up 3 options, or you could have 20 or 50 or 100, as many as you like really. But how those options are kept is another matter. Now in this particular example we're going to keep them in what I think is probably the easiest way that there is, but later on in the course we're going to have to extend this into some sort of more complex and flexible arrangements. So all I do here is when I click in data type, the option I'm going to select is Lookup Wizard, because the options that are available here will be looked up from a list, and we're going to set this list up using the Lookup Wizard. Now the Lookup Wizard is a sequence of screens, and on the first page it says the wizard creates a lookup field which displays a list of values you can choose from. How do you want your lookup field to get its values? Well, the first option is to get the values from another table or from a database query. Now that's the method we're going to use later. For this first example we're just going to type in the values that are available, so we're going to choose the second option. Click Next. Now when it comes to setting the options up, the user may be selecting from just a list of single items, or the list itself they choose from could be more complex, and it could have more than one column of information in the list. Now we're going to stick with a 1-column example here, and the options we're offering for activity level are leisurely or leisurely, moderate, and challenging. And each of our trips will be classified according to one of those 3 options. So having entered the 3 options, we click on Next. What label would you like for your lookup field? Well, I'm going to stick with activity level. I should point out that generally speaking, when I'm naming fields, I name them without spaces, and I try to use pretty straightforward simple names which reflect what information is in each field. Various people use various other approaches to naming fields. Some people will put spaces in them. There's no reason that you shouldn't technically, but they do cause a little bit more work later on, particularly if you get into programming within Access 2016. And once you have spaces in field names, there are certain conventions you have to follow when referring to fields, and I don't find a particular need to put spaces in. I tend to use a version of what's called camel case, or there's various other names by which it's known, whereby I keep the capitalization on the words, so activity level has a capital A and a capital on the first L, to make it easier to see what the words in the name are. Similarly for trip name there. Some people put underscores between the words. That's fine, that avoids the space issue, and some people will even put prefixes on field names in order to reflect what sort of data it is. So an integer field they'd put an int at the start of. A text field they may put something like txt at the start of. But as I say, when I'm naming fields in Access 2016 I tend to use pretty straightforward names. Now back to the Lookup Wizard, Limit to List is next. Do I want to limit the user's choices to that list of levels? The answer in this case is yes, I do. I don't want somebody who is setting up or changing information about trips to introduce a new level. So they have to choose one of the 3 available levels. Of course, at some later stage I may well change the list, I may introduce other levels, but I want that done in a controlled kind of way. The next option there is allow multiple values. Now this is really quite a controversial feature in Access. It was introduced relatively recently, and what this means is that if you have a list such as this one, you can select more than one of the available values. Now in the case of these activity levels, choosing two different ones like leisurely and challenging, for example, would seem a bit bizarre. But if you take a different example, supposing I was setting up a list for choosing country from, it might be perfectly valid to choose two or more countries from the list because the trip might go through two or more countries. Now you can do that in Access. You could set up a list exactly like that for countries. You could allow multiple values, but we're not going to do that because from a database design point of view, using this feature in Access is not good, and most of the database designers and developers I know do not use this feature for reasons that will become apparent later on. You can use it, it does work, but it doesn't really follow good database design principles. Now in this case we're not allowing multiple values, so we can just leave that particular checkbox unchecked and click on Finish. So let me add a description for this field, and then let me set the field properties. Field size, well, it certainly doesn't have to be 255 characters because it's only holding one word, but let's say be a little bit conservative and say 30 characters. This is the maximum size, by the way. In older database design and development tools, when you gave a field size, every time you recorded something it took that amount of space, so you could be very wasteful by declaring these sizes to be too big. Nowadays that is really only setting a maximum, and therefore you can be a little bit over generous. And in this case, for example, you may come up with an activity level later on where the length of the word or words is longer than any of the three that we have already. Now I'm again going to skip the next half dozen field. Is activity level required? Well, yes it is. We always tell our potential travellers how active a trip is. Do we allow a 0 length activity level? No, we don't. And is it indexed? Well, yes it is, because we'll quite often want to search, say, on leisurely trips, and we want to be able to identify those without looking at every trip in the list. So in this case it's yes, and in fact it's yes with duplicates okay, because there will be many trips that have the same value in activity level. For instance, many trips where the activity level is moderate. So we've set those general properties, but this particular short text field uses a lookup, and therefore we can click on the Lookup tab there within the field properties, and you can see additional properties related to the lookup. The first of those is the display control that will be used by default for this field on a form, and the control that's going to be used is a combo box. If you're not familiar with these display controls, you don't know what a combo box is, I'm going to show you one of those a little bit later on in the course and explain how they work in relation to a lookup. The second property, the row source type, relates to the choice that we made very early on using the Lookup Wizard, where it said, do you want to get the values for the list from a table or a query, or would you like to type them in? Well, we chose to type them in, which is the value list option there. If instead of that we'd gone for example, a table or query, then table or query would have been shown here, but value list is the option we're using. And there is our list of 3 values. They're in double quotes, separated by semicolons. If I want to add a value here, or even delete one of these, I can do it just by typing in here. So let me put a new value in. I've decided that some of our trips are not quite leisurely and not quite moderate, so I've introduced a new value there, leisurely to moderate. That's not longer than 30 characters, so that's fine. And then moving down, the other choices were made. Limit to list. Is the user limited to choosing from the list? Yes. Do we allow multiple values? No. There's one other setting here which defaults to yes. Allow value list edits. so that allow users to edit the values that are in the list. I'm going to change that to no, because I'm certainly not going to allow that. And that's it. That's the settings for the activity level field. What I now need to do is to set an appropriate value for our Louisiana Explorer trip. Now, as soon as I try to switch back into datasheet view, Access 2016 realizes that I have made a change to the design of this table. So, do you want to save the table now? Yes. Now it's going to check the data integrity rules. You don't have to have the data integrity rules checked. Normally you will want to, but one particular situation where this can prove annoying is if you've just added a field and you know that even though it's a required field, existing records won't have values in there yet. You still have to go in and give those existing records values in that new or changed field. So what happens if I say yes at this point is that I get a message saying existing data violates the new setting for the required property for field activity level. Now you can either say, yep, I know about that, but keep the setting that I've just made and continue testing, in which case you click on yes. If you want to revert to the old setting but continue testing, you click on no. And to stop testing, just to go into datasheet view, all you need to do is press the cancel key. So that's what I'm going to do on this occasion. Now I can go into that new field, activity level. When I click in there, I get a drop down and I can choose one of my allowed values. I'm going to choose the second value, leisurely to moderate. And I'm also going to just widen that field enough that you can see the field that's in there. The next field that I'm going to add is the country field. Now, as I discussed earlier on, ultimately we need to be able to specify that a trip visits a number of countries, but at this stage all I'm going to do is to record the main country that a trip visits. And I'm going to use a lookup again, so I'm going to put in a value list. On this occasion though, I'm going to say that the selection is not limited to the list. I'm not quite sure which countries are initially going to be available in our trips. That will obviously develop in the early stages of designing, building and using the database. So I expect the list to be quite dynamic in the early stages as we add more and more countries to it. So as people are setting up our trips, I want them to be able to add countries that aren't in the list. So in the case of the country field, the user will not be limited to list. So I'm going to do that now. Join me again when I've completed it. So there we are, country is set up. Let me go into datasheet view and record the country for the Louisiana Explorer. Okay, that's done. And we've just got one more field to do in this section. This next field is description, and it certainly won't be a short text field. Although sometimes it may be shorter than 255 characters, often it will be quite a bit longer, although probably only a few sentences. The data type we're going to use for this is long text, and in fact a long text field can hold something up to about a gigabyte of text. That's quite a long description. However, using access forms and so on, you're restricted to displaying and using round about 64,000 characters. So we wouldn't be able to let a description get quite as huge as the maximum size that this data type can support. I'm going to use long text. I'm going to set the properties. And the main one to point out is that you wouldn't normally have a long text field indexed. So indexed in this case will be no. So I'll do that. Join me again in a moment. Then we'll switch into datasheet view and add a description for the Louisiana Explorer. So that's the description of our sort of dummy tour. We've got just a few more fields to add now, and all of these other fields are numeric. We're going to cover those in the next section. Please join me for that.
Hi, Molly here. Thanks for watching. If you need additional Access 2016 training, get our free 3-hour course for beginners. Click the Get My Free Course button on the right. I'll see you next week with additional videos.